Ethan Brooks adjusted the collar of his shirt for the third time in as many minutes, though he knew no one would notice. The office was nearly empty, a hushed labyrinth of cubicles and fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to make the quiet feel alive. Ethan liked the silence. It was the one place where he could think without interruptions, even if the solitude sometimes made his thoughts spiral in directions he preferred to keep locked away. That he glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. Most of his co-workers had left hours ago, retreating to their apartments, dinners, or whatever distractions kept them away from the monotony of spreadsheets and reports. But Ethan lingered, drawn by an inexplicable urge to stay, to finish the final touches on a presentation he could have left for tomorrow. Something in him wanted to see the night through, wanted to test the limits of his patience, or perhaps his courage. Ethan, burning the midnight oil again. The voice came from behind the cubicle wall. He jumped slightly, realizing how tense he had been without noticing that it was Liam Carter, his co-worker and occasional source of both amusement and confusion. Liam leaned casually against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, wearing a lopsided grin that somehow made Ethan feel both intrigued and guilty at the same time. Liam had a knack for appearing when least expected, a walking reminder that life was rarely as controlled as Ethan liked it. Just finishing some things, Ethan said, trying to keep his tone neutral. He felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the cold hum of the office air conditioning. Liam's eyes, bright and teasing, didn't help. You always work late. Ever think about doing other things? Liam's voice was casual, but the undercurrent made it impossible for Ethan to ignore. He wanted to laugh it off, to brush it away like a passing breeze, but his pulse had already started to betray him. There was something about Liam's presence, his easy charm, his confident posture, that made Ethan reconsider every thought he tried to dismiss that evening. Ethan turned back to his computer screen, focusing on the spreadsheet in front of him, but the numbers blurred. He found himself imagining conversations that hadn't happened, scenarios where boundaries were tested, and rules quietly bent. Ethan had always considered himself cautious, rational, grounded, but the combination of silence, isolation, and Liam's subtle provocations had begun to loosen that control. A sharp click of a key echoed through the empty office. Ethan jumped again. This time, it wasn't Liam who had appeared. It was someone else entirely, a presence he hadn't anticipated. Jordan Hayes, the building's security guard, stood at the end of the aisle. He was tall, with a posture that suggested authority without aggression, and eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. Ethan felt exposed, though he knew it was irrational. Jordan was there to ensure safety, not judge. Yet there was a weight in his gaze that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Still here? Jordan asked, his voice low, even, but with a tone that suggested observation more than inquiry. Ethan nodded, feeling the words catch in his throat. Yeah, just finishing up. Jordan's eyes didn't leave him. There was something deliberate in the way he stood, an unspoken question hanging between them. Ethan wasn't sure if it was curiosity, concern, or something entirely different. It made him conscious of his every move, every subtle shift in posture or glance. Minutes passed. The office lights hummed, and the quiet seemed almost tangible. Liam's earlier teasing faded into memory, leaving Ethan with the heavier sensation of being watched, evaluated, considered. He could feel the tension coil tighter in his chest, an invisible thread pulling him toward choices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Jordan finally stepped closer, and Ethan noticed the subtle scent of cologne that lingered, a clean, slightly musky aroma that seemed entirely out of place in the sterile office environment. Ethan, Jordan said, softer now, could you step into the security office for a moment? There's something I need to discuss. Ethan hesitated. His mind raced. Is it something urgent? He asked, unsure whether the question was professional or something more. Jordan gave a faint nod, his expression neutral but firm. It's better if we talk privately. The words hung in the air, a quiet invitation wrapped in authority. Ethan felt his chest tighten with anticipation, an odd mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and something else he couldn't name. He glanced toward the exit, considering turning down the hall instead, pretending a call or email had suddenly reminded him of another task, but the pull toward the private office was stronger than his caution. Liam had returned to his desk a few minutes prior, but now he was gone. The hallway beyond the cubicles stretched empty, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows that swayed slightly with the air conditioning. Ethan walked slowly, deliberately, each step echoing softly against the tile floor. He felt like he was crossing a threshold, stepping into a space where the rules he'd followed for years didn't quite apply. Jordan opened the door to the security office before Ethan reached it. The interior was cramped but tidy, filled with monitors displaying various corners of the building, all flickering with tiny, grainy images of empty hallways and stairwells. Jordan gestured for Ethan to enter. "Have a seat," Jordan said, motioning toward a chair across from his desk. Ethan complied, heart racing. The room smelled faintly of coffee and electronics, but it was more than that. The air carried a sense of expectation, of a story about to begin, though Ethan had no idea what role he was meant to play. Jordan leaned back in his chair, hands clasped loosely on the desk. He said nothing at first, letting the silence settle, letting Ethan feel the weight of being alone, under observation, and somehow understood all at once. Ethan's thoughts swirled, the quiet office, Liam's teasing earlier, Jordan's calm authority. Each element seemed to converge here, in this small room, creating a tension he couldn't ignore. Finally, Jordan spoke again. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Not about work. Something different." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure whether he was ready for whatever different meant. And yet, as the words settled around him, he felt a strange, undeniable pull, a curiosity that promised both excitement and complication. He realized then that whatever was about to unfold in this room could change things, perhaps in ways he hadn't anticipated. The room was small. The air was thick. And for the first time that evening, Ethan felt that he was no longer alone in the world he thought he controlled so carefully. Something new had begun, and he didn't know how, or if, he could stop it. Ethan sat stiffly in the security office, his hands resting lightly on his knees, though they felt far too heavy for the weight they carried. Jordan Hayes leaned back in his chair, calm and composed, watching Ethan with a gaze that seemed to measure everything he said before it even left his lips. There was a subtle tension in the room, almost imperceptible at first, but enough to make Ethan acutely aware of every breath, every shift in posture. "Do you usually stay this late?" Jordan asked, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a hint of curiosity that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Not really," Ethan admitted, forcing a casual tone. "Just, sometimes things pile up." His eyes flicked toward the monitors on the wall, though the grainy images of empty hallways held no comfort, only a sense of being watched. Jordan nodded slowly. "I get it. Some of us prefer the quiet. Some of us need it." His words weren't overt, but the weight behind them suggested an understanding of more than just office routines. Ethan felt a shiver pass through him, an unfamiliar thrill that made the small room feel smaller, more intimate. The conversation lingered in the air, neither pushing nor retreating, and Ethan realized he was holding his own breath. There was something about Jordan, not just the calm authority, but the subtle warmth, the way his words seemed to resonate deeper than surface-level office chatter. Ethan had never been this aware of another person in a professional context, yet here he was, drawn in, intrigued, almost uncomfortably so. Jordan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I've noticed you around," he said. "You have a way of noticing things too. The little details most people miss." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Compliments were rare, and Jordan's tone made it feel different, personal, intentional, and unsettling all at once. He looked away for a moment, staring at the wall, trying to ground himself, but the words lingered, echoing in the quiet room. "I guess I pay attention," Ethan replied cautiously. His voice was steadier than he felt, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity he couldn't disguise. Something in Jordan's presence demanded it. For a moment, neither spoke. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the monitors, each one flickering with silent images of empty corridors, stairwells, and offices. Ethan's mind raced, tracing back to earlier that evening, the subtle teasing from Liam, the empty office, the flickering fluorescent lights. He felt a twinge of guilt he couldn't quite place, an awareness that the direction of his thoughts had already begun to shift. Jordan broke the silence with a small smile, just enough to suggest he understood. "You're not the only one who feels out of place sometimes," he said. "Even in a space like this, it's easy to feel isolated." Ethan swallowed. The words were simple, but the way they landed in the quiet room made his stomach tighten. He wanted to nod, to respond, to ask questions, but the air seemed charged with something unsaid. He realized he was teetering on the edge of a choice, whether to retreat back into the familiar or step closer to a tension he didn't fully understand. I guess," Ethan managed. "It's different when it's just me. Quiet. You notice things about yourself you usually ignore." His words were hesitant but honest. He hadn't planned to speak so openly, but Jordan's presence seemed to strip away the usual barriers, leaving him exposed in ways both thrilling and terrifying. Jordan tilted his head slightly, as though considering Ethan's words carefully. "That's exactly it," he said. "Sometimes noticing things about yourself means noticing others too. And sometimes, it makes you feel things you weren't expecting." Ethan's pulse jumped at the implication. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve, aware of a growing tension in his chest. He wasn't sure what Jordan meant entirely, but he felt the pull all the same, a magnetic, undeniable draw that made him question boundaries he had always believed were firm. The conversation shifted naturally, flowing into stories neither of them had planned but both seemed compelled to share. Jordan spoke of his own late nights, the solitude, and the rare encounters that left a mark beyond the professional. Ethan listened, captivated not just by the words but by the rhythm, the confidence, and the subtle vulnerability that threaded through them. Each story, each pause, each glance added layers to a connection that had begun as casual observation but was rapidly becoming more complicated. Ethan felt a tension build inside him, one that wasn't entirely comfortable but strangely addictive. He knew this was more than a simple late-night conversation. There was a thrill in the uncertainty, in the subtle closeness, in the unspoken acknowledgement that something unusual was unfolding. He could feel himself leaning in, drawn toward Jordan's energy even as part of him whispered caution. Jordan noticed. Of course he did. There was a slight arch of his brow, a faint shift in posture, but no words, just presence, magnetic and deliberate. Ethan felt the pull intensify, an almost dizzying awareness of proximity, of possibility. For a moment, time itself seemed to stretch. The office outside faded into irrelevance, the hum of fluorescent lights, the flicker of monitors, and the distant city sounds all receded until there was only the charged silence between them. Ethan's mind raced, what he should do, what he wanted to do, what he might regret later, but the hesitation didn't stop the growing fascination, the undeniable tension that threaded through every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Finally, Jordan leaned back slightly, breaking the silence just enough to give space for thought. "I won't lie," he said, his tone casual but deliberate, "sometimes we encounter people in places we least expect, and it changes something inside us." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't know if it was fear, anticipation, or something more profound, but he understood the meaning. Something had shifted in this room, something he could neither control nor ignore. And as he left the security office later that night, the memory of Jordan's calm gaze, his stories, and the unspoken tension lingered like a shadow, pulling at thoughts he hadn't realized were vulnerable. As Ethan returned to the quiet cubicles, the empty office felt smaller, the night heavier, and the boundaries he had taken for granted subtly blurred. He knew he had stepped into something unpredictable, an emotional risk he wasn't prepared for, yet couldn't resist. And though he walked back to his desk, finishing his work in mechanical motion, his mind replayed Jordan's words, his posture, his presence, leaving Ethan suspended between guilt and anticipation, curiosity and caution, craving and restraint. Ethan Brooks returned to his desk, the hum of fluorescent lights now somehow louder, sharper, as if each flicker emphasized the tension still coiling in his chest. The office, once a place of comfort in its quiet monotony, now felt charged with invisible threads that tied him to moments in the security office he couldn't erase from memory. Every glance at the empty cubicles, every echo of distant footsteps, reminded him of the pull he had felt, the subtle danger in a connection he hadn't expected. He tried to focus on finishing his report, typing mechanically, but his thoughts refused to obey. Jordan Hayes' presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of his mind, the calm authority, the quiet curiosity, the way his words had landed with a weight Ethan hadn't anticipated. There was an intimacy in their conversation, a closeness that had nothing to do with touch but everything to do with awareness, and it left Ethan restless. Liam Carter reappeared shortly after, sliding into the chair across from Ethan with a grin that was too familiar, too effortless. "Still here?" Liam asked, raising an eyebrow. He didn't wait for an answer, just leaned back, letting the casual tension hang between them. Ethan's stomach tightened, a reminder that the emotional entanglement he had begun with Jordan was only complicated by Liam's easy presence. Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, finishing some work." His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. He felt caught between two currents, Liam, whose flirtation was playful yet grounding, and Jordan, whose quiet intensity had stirred something new and unmanageable. "You know," Liam continued, tilting his head, "there are easier ways to get your mind off work than staying late here alone." His tone was teasing, but underneath it lay an edge of sincerity. Ethan felt the familiar tug of guilt, the awareness that he was entertaining thoughts and emotions he had never allowed himself before. That he looked down at his hands, trying to steady the racing pulse. "I just needed the quiet," he said. The words were true, but incomplete. The quiet wasn't what he sought, it was what allowed him to feel, to think, to experience something he could barely name. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of typing broken only by stolen glances at the monitors across the office. Ethan's mind replayed the security room conversation repeatedly, Jordan's calm gaze, the way he had listened, the way his words had drawn Ethan out of himself without pressing, without judgment. Each memory carried a subtle ache of longing, a curiosity about what might have been said if the moment had stretched further. By the time Ethan shut down his computer, the office was utterly empty. The night outside the windows was deep and silent, city lights reflecting faintly on the glass panels. He packed his bag slowly, deliberately, as if the act of leaving could somehow reset the emotions that had been stirred. But the tension followed him, a persistent hum in his chest that made each step toward the exit feel heavier than it should have. As he passed the security office, Jordan was there again, checking monitors, seemingly absorbed in work. Their eyes met briefly. Ethan felt a jolt, not fear, not excitement, but something closer to recognition, as if the room they had shared carried an invisible weight that extended beyond its walls. Jordan gave a small nod, acknowledging him without a word, and in that brief gesture, Ethan sensed both connection and restraint. Walking toward the elevator, Ethan's mind raced. He considered the implications of his feelings, the curiosity, the tension, the undeniable draw toward someone who was, by all practical standards, a stranger in his professional life. And yet, he also thought of Liam, whose presence was warm, familiar, and safe. Ethan realized that what had begun as a late-night office encounter had shifted the balance of his emotions, leaving him suspended between desire and loyalty, temptation and conscience. The elevator ride was quiet. Ethan stared at the glowing floor numbers, feeling a subtle ache in his chest. He wasn't naive, he knew what had happened in the security office wasn't entirely innocent, at least in the realm of emotional fidelity. He had crossed into a space where curiosity and connection mingled in a way that made him question his own boundaries. Yet there was no regret, only awareness, a sharp clarity that what he felt was real, complicated, and deeply human. Stepping out onto the street, Ethan inhaled the cool night air, letting it fill his lungs, grounding him just enough to think clearly. The city was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic, and he walked slowly, letting his mind unravel the threads of the evening. He thought of Jordan's calm authority, the subtle intimacy of their conversation, and the way his own emotions had been stirred without a single overt action. He thought of Liam's easy charm, the warmth of friendship, and the playful tension that reminded him of comfort and connection. Ethan realized that this was only the beginning. The choices he would make, how he navigated his emotions, how he engaged with the people who now mattered in unexpected ways, would define not just the night, but perhaps who he was willing to become. He didn't have the answers, and the uncertainty was both frightening and exhilarating. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a continuation of the tension with Jordan, not something physical, but an emotional tether, a thread of connection that lingered and demanded attention. And then he remembered Liam, who would greet him with a grin and an easy joke, grounding him back in the familiarity of the known. Ethan understood then that his heart had been stretched between two currents, each pulling in opposite directions, and that navigating the space between them would require courage, honesty, and perhaps a willingness to embrace discomfort. As he reached the entrance of his apartment building, Ethan paused. The night felt alive, heavy with potential, each shadow and sound carrying unspoken possibilities. He knew he had stepped into a moment that could change him, a moment where desire, curiosity, and connection intersected in ways he hadn't anticipated. And though the story of the night was unfinished, he carried its weight with him, an invisible reminder that boundaries were sometimes fragile, that emotions could be perilously complex, and that the heart often demanded more than logic could contain. Ethan's eyes lingered on the dark streets, the empty sidewalks, and the distant glow of city lights. He realized that the consequences of his evening, what he felt, what he might do, and how he might navigate the tangle of emotions, would not resolve quickly. But for the first time, he didn't fear the uncertainty. He felt a strange clarity, a readiness to explore the tension, the desire, and the uncharted spaces within himself. And with that quiet resolve, he stepped inside, carrying the echoes of the night with him, knowing that tomorrow, or perhaps even the next encounter, would demand choices he was now both willing and unable to ignore.